And welcome to the Justice Committee's 5th meeting of 2017. Agenda item number 1 is a decision on whether to take items 6 and 7 in private. Item 6 is a paper on future scrutiny of the Railway Policing Scotland Bill, and item 7 is consideration of a discussion paper on our inquiry into the role and purpose of the Crown and Procurator Fiscal Service. And also, could I ask members if they're content to take a future draft report of our inquiry for the Crown and Procurator Fiscal in private, also all subsequent draft reports. Are we agreed? Agreed. Thank you for that. Next item on the agenda is an affirmative instrument on the draft Stop and Search Code of Practice Appointed Days Scotland Regulations 2017, and I welcome Michael Matheson, Cabinet Secretary for Justice, Stephen Jones, Head of Policing Powers, and Craig French, Directorate of Legal Services at the Scottish Government, to the committee this morning. Remind members that officials are permitted to give evidence under this item but may not participate in the formal debate on the instruments under item 3 of the agenda. I refer members to paper 1, which is a note by the clerk, and ask the Cabinet Secretary if you want to make an opening statement.
Convener, thank you for your invitation to appear before the committee today to discuss the Stop and Search Code of Practice. Members will be aware that the Justice Subcommittee on Policing took evidence on the 26th of January from John Scott QC and others, and the Subcommittee has already considered issues raised in written evidence. I thought it would be helpful if today I made some brief opening remarks before taking questions. Stop and Search is at the heart of the delicate balance that we need to strike between the need to protect people and keep them safe and the need to safeguard the rights of the individual. As such, I have been keen to achieve consensus on this issue. I've also been keen to ensure that any changes to Stop and Search are evidence-based and that we use legislation to effect change where necessary. I thank members of the committee, both past and present, for their interest in this area and for their constructive engagement with me during the passage of the Criminal Justice Act. I was keen to continue that collaborative and evidence-based approach when revising the draft code after the public consultation. That's why I established the Stop and Search Advisory Group chaired by John Scott QC. And I'd like to place on record my sincere thanks to John Scott and the group for their significant contribution to this work. I would also like to recognise that Police Scotland has already made significant improvements to Stop and Search in advance of the code coming into force. Police Scotland has engaged willingly, positively and constructively with the advisory group and with the government in the production of this code. I know that John Scott and the group greatly appreciate this. It's important to note, Convener, that there is consensus amongst advisory group members about all of the changes that have been made to the draft code as a result of the consultation responses. It's also important to know that the code will be kept under regular review and will make any further changes to the code based on evidence. I've asked the advisory group to continue to play a role in helping the government to assess evidence after the code has been in force for 12 months, with an interim assessment after 6 months. If the evidence points to a need for any change in the code or changes to legislation, then this is something which we will consider in due course. In summary, Convener, we have taken an evidence-based collaborative approach to drafting the code. The code gives us a sound framework to record and monitor how Stop and Search is being used and to gather further evidence. I will continue to work with the advisory group, key stakeholders and the committee to assess and act on evidence as it emerges. And I'm happy to take any questions from the committee.
Okay, questions from the committee. Liam, John Finney and Stuart Stevenson.
Very much, Convener. Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. We did, as you say, have a very useful session with John Scott and others in the subcommittee a week or so ago. And I think it was encouraging to hear the level of consensus there is around where we've kind of got to, both from Police Scotland as well as obviously from members of the advisory group. I suppose where there was one area of dispute and disagreement amongst those we heard evidence from was around the figures. I mean, I think I quoted the figures that I'm aware of in the public domain of a reduction in stop and search as a whole of around 93.5% in a very short space of time, 99.5% in terms of consensual stop and search, which seem to back up the arguments about this being a tactic inappropriately used. But those figures themselves were called into question. I wonder whether you have a view on whether or not the baseline figures for the use of stop and search generally and for unregulated stop and search were robust, and if they weren't, if there are figures that you're aware of that would give a clearer picture, a more accurate picture of the change that we've seen in terms of the use of this tactic in the last year or so.
I think it'd be fair to say that the historical figures were not robust, and HMICS in their report recognised that they were not robust. Part of that is down to the recording methods of the previous legacy forces and a combination as to how some of that then followed into Police Scotland as a single force. I think it'd be fair to say now from the evidence that you received from ACC Williams last week is that they have a much more robust system in place now for recording stop and search, and how that's now collected at a national level and it's analysed at a national level. So I think the more up-to-date figures in the last year in particular are a more accurate reflection of stop and search being used by Police Scotland. But there's no doubt from the report which HMICS conducted into stop and search data is that there were significant flaws in how that information was being collated and handled. And I think what the code allows us to do is to make sure that we now move into a much better place in having a clearer set of rules around the use of stop and search and how that should be recorded, both at an officer level and right through into how the service will then collect that data and publish it in an annual basis. And as you'll be aware, a requirement under the Criminal Justice Act is that an annual set of data has to be published, and it also sets down the categories as well, from age through to gender, through to national origin, all of which have to be published now by Police Scotland on an annual basis.
Well, what JCC Williams was saying last week, it appeared, was that officers and parts of the force had almost got into a habit of using this tactic almost as a first resort rather than a last resort, and that what had been witnessed over the last year or so was the deployment of other techniques, so to speak, in ensuring that policing remains effective, but which in a sense leaves the stop and search option as effectively the last option, or where there is a suspicion of something that would merit a search under regulated terms. I mean, would that concur with your impression?
Well, what happened was there was a piece of work carried out by the Scottish Police Authority looking at the issue of stop and search. There was then a piece of follow-up work carried out by HMICS looking at the data collection around stop and search. And one of the suggestions that was made by HMICS was that there should be a presumption against the use of consensual stop and search. And Police Scotland have been operating on that basis since March 2015, that they've no longer been using or they have been reducing the use of consensual stop and search. And what has happened, I think, during the course of that time is that there has been a concerted effort on the part of Police Scotland to have more accurate recording of stop and search, and also to see us phasing out of consensual stop and search. As a result of that, I think the data which we now have over the last year with the national unit they now have in Stop and Search is that we can be, I think we can be more confident about that information. But what the code will specifically do, though, is it will actually set that framework in a much clearer fashion so that there are no doubts about what has to be recorded, how it should be conducted, when it should be conducted, as well, and we'll place it all on a statutory footing. So I think part of the issues that you've raised, I think, highlights some of the, I think at times, some of the uncertainty around the way in which Stop and Search has been used and the various approaches that there were to stop and searches in the previous legacy forces and how that was then, some of that was then taken into Police Scotland. But I think the code will put us into a much better place and giving us greater clarity in a way which we haven't had historically, and will give the committee and others a much clearer insight into exactly how Police Scotland are using Stop and Search and when they're using Stop and Search. And also to make sure that the police are using it as an effective tool in order to prevent and to tackle crime, because it is an effective tool as and when it's used appropriately. And the code aims to support and assisting the police in being able to do that. And
I mean, that the point you make about it being an effective tool, I think, is something that's often lost in the wider debate about how it's been used in the past. But given the dramatic fall we've seen, in a sense, the removal of the consensual stop and search as an option, but actually the significant drop in stop and search overall, there isn't any evidence at this stage that policing has been less effective either in the generality or in particular areas as a result in that reduction in the use of that tactic in particular.
No, there isn't any evidence. I know that there have been suggestions that the loss of consensual stop and search could result in particular types of crime increasing. So in particular, there's been reference made to the possibility of an increase in knife crime. From the evidence that we've considered, the evidence that the advisory group have considered, there is no evidence that provides a correlation between the two. It's also worth keeping in mind is that stop and search in England and Wales has been in a statutory footing for almost 30 years now. And there were issues around how stop and search was being used within the Metropolitan Police Division. And at that time, they looked at the issue where there was a correlation between some forms of violent crime that were taking place and stop and search. And the Home Office come up with the same view, is that there is no evidence that actually links the two. So, you know, does a greater level of stop and search result in a reduction in these crimes, or does it a reduction in stop and search result in an increase in particular types of crime? And there is no evidence to support a correlation between the two. Having said that, I think it's an area we need to keep under very careful review. We need to continue to monitor that. If there is any new and emerging evidence that would suggest there are issues that need to be considered in the way in which stop and search is used, in the way in which it's applied by the police, then I think it's responsible it's a responsibility of us all to make sure that we consider that. And that's why the code has been drafted in such a way as it will allow us to revisit it at any point in the future, as and when there is any new evidence that would suggest we need to change it or we need to alter it. And I think it's also incumbent on the police that if they believe that they require powers for particular purposes, that there should be evidence to support a justification for that, so that powers which we provide to the police are based upon clear evidence that can demonstrate that they will have a beneficial effect in keeping our community safe and in preventing crime. And on this particular issue around consensual stop and search, there hasn't been any evidence that I'm aware of and that the advisory group were aware of that demonstrated that. I think actually in the evidence which the subcommittee received as well, I think there was, although there were those who were putting the proposition, they felt that it potentially could really lead to an increase in some types of crime, they accepted that there was a lack of evidence to actually support that proposition at this particular point.
John Finney, followed by Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I don't think anyone would dispute that stop and search is an important tool in the police armoury, but only if it used appropriately, and to my mind appropriately would be used very sparingly. Both the impact assessment and the consultation highlighted the need, quote, for an easy to understand guide to the code aimed at members of the public. And I think it's important that we have informed citizens, particularly young people. Could you advise how the Scottish Government, and I'm aware that you're going to post these guides on your website, but you'll understand it not necessarily be a first port of call for young people, how that information will be got out so that people fully understand their rights, but also their responsibilities?
Well, you're correct. It will be placed on line for individuals to access. It will also be made available at all police stations as well. We're also working just now with the advisory group to produce a plain English version of it, which will be available to members of the public. But the member who I know has a long-standing interest in this issue, as well as Mr MacArthur, is that and the particular impact it had on young people and children, is that we're also working to develop a children and young people's guide to stop and search as well, which would be appropriate to that particular age group. So a combination of having it available online, having it available in police stations, but also producing a plain English version of it and also a children and young people's version of it as well, to try and help to support individuals in understanding what the rights are and how stop and search should be applied.
Okay, thank you.
Stuart Stevenson, to be followed by Douglas Rona, then Mary.
Thank you, Convener. The Code of Conduct removes some options that the police have previously had. It puts it on a formal basis. I just wonder if the Minister can confirm that, notwithstanding the existence of the Code of Practice and the essentially restrictions it can place, that police can address overriding issues of safety and do whatever is necessary to preserve life in the circumstances in which they find themselves.
Well, there was an issue of concern that part of the code, section 3 of the code and section 3.3 of the code, around how that would be applied in instances where officers in a private place may be dealing with someone who they felt there was a threat to their life, someone who was potentially suicidal, and whether they would be able to search that individual to check to see if they had any items which were a matter of concern that could result in them harming themselves. Following the consultation on the draft code, 3.4 was introduced by the advisory group, which in effect gives the police that additional comfort that in reminding them that they have that overall responsibility to the duty to protect life. And that in an instance like that, they would have the ability to be able to search that individual to see if they had any items on them that could cause them harm. I think during the evidence as well that the subcommittee received, John Scott explained that a combination of what's been provided within the code to address the concern which was there. And I think it'd be fair to say, I think Police Scotland are also comforted by that provision within the code. But if you also keep in mind within the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act, there is that explicit responsibility on constables to protect life. When that's read alongside ECHR and the need to preserve life under Article 2, both of them give comfort to the fact that from a legislative point of view there is legislation there that would support the police in acting in that way in a private place, someone who they thought was at risk, that particularly if they were at risk of suicide, who may have something on them that could cause harm to them, to be able to have the power to be able to search them in doing so. So that was an issue that was picked up during the course of the consultation exercise. And what we'll do in going forward is we'll continue to monitor how that's being applied. And Police Scotland feels though that gives them enough comfort as it stands at the present time. But if there's a need for us to look at any further legislative changes going forward to address that, then we can consider that in due course.
Thank you.
Douglas Ross.
Just to follow on that point from Mr Stevenson, at the moment you have got no intentions to legislate for that element?
No, we've got no specific intentions to at the present time.
And so what is the timescales will you allow for this? Is it just if Police Scotland come back to you at any point? Will you review it in 6 months, a year? I know the Dr Scott's group are reviewing it at intervals. Will it be on recommendation, further recommendation from him, because he has included in his evidence to the subcommittee that he believes that a legislative solution may be required? Is it his evidence? Is it Police Scotland's evidence? How would you view the competing demands to legislate in this area?
So it'll be over the course of the next year when we're reviewing how the code has been implemented. So there'll be the 6-month interim review, and then there'll be the complete review at the end of the year. If there is a following on from what we have in the code at the present time, if there's a feeling from Police Scotland and advisory group that we should bring forward some form of legislative change, then we'll look for an opportunity going forward to do that. So once we've completed the first full year, we'll then be in a better place to make a decision on that.
Can I ask your response to the comments by Callum Steele on behalf of the Scottish Police Federation? It was Liam MacArthur started off asking about some of these issues, but his specific points about the bureaucracy might turn some officers away from using these powers.
I'm not entirely sure whether that will be the case. I think there is a need to make sure that we have in place a system that is robust and effective, that allows effective recording of the use of stop and search, that the balance between preserving the rights of the public around stop and search and the need for the police to effectively record that are important. And I think in the evidence that was provided by Police Scotland, ACC Williams was quite clear. He felt that any additional bureaucracy that goes alongside this is actually balanced out by the public trust and the public confidence that comes from having a code in place. So they're trying to get that balance right. And I think the code by and large achieves that. If over the course of the 6 months to a year, once the code has been applied, if there are issues being highlighted that are a particular problem to Police Scotland, that allows us the opportunity to revisit that. But Police Scotland have been very heavily engaged in this whole process to make sure we try and get it as right as possible. And I think any small amount of additional bureaucracy that's attached to the application of the code, I think is outweighed by the benefits we get from public trust and public assurance around how stop and search has been used by the police.
So do you think Callum Steele's incorrect in his assumptions?
No, I just don't agree with his particular view on this. I think the code gets it broadly quite probably right, and I think over the course of the year we'll be able to monitor that.
And finally, can I ask, do you anticipate any areas in Scotland where the number of stop and searches will increase as a result of this?
Not at the present time.
Do you not think there is a possibility that in some areas that didn't take the approach that the former Strathclyde area took, and they resisted some of the demands under the previous leadership of Police Scotland, that now with the extra training that some officers who were not particularly used to doing stop and search under the old procedures, with new training, new awareness amongst officers in certain parts of Scotland, actually we will see for a period a spike in the number of stop and searches?
No, not necessarily. The reason being is because the significant increase that we had in some areas was because of the use of consensual stop and search, which the code will bring an end to. So all stop and search will have to be conducted on a statutory basis. So what will happen will be, is that as a part of the code, is that the data for local command areas will go to local commanders and how stop and search has been used at a localised level. They'll be able to consider that to make sure that it's appropriate and it's in compliance with the code. And that will then be applied at a national level. So I think if you look back at the history of this issue, the big numbers around stop and search were to do with consensual stop and search, not statutory-based stop and search.
I put that same question to Dr Scott, and I would reiterate what you said. I think the work he and the advisory group have done has been excellent, and also I welcome the opportunity he gave for party spokespersons to meet with him and discuss it. But he did accept that there could be some parts of Scotland which previously hadn't really used stop and search powers at all. They hadn't really gone down the route that could be seen in the west of Scotland, central Scotland, etc., could now, with this new training coming in, officers go along to a training session, get this information about stop and search, and then go out and use it more readily. So he did accept that that could happen, but you're suggesting it won't.
Well, I think we'll find out over the course of the next year. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that it will, because statutory stop and search has always been there. So unless there's a change in tactics, which are in the way in which it's been used within a local command area, we're not providing any additional powers here. So it's always a provision which has been there. Police officers are trained in the use of statutory stop and search. What we're doing is that the training which officers are now going through is because of the application of the new code. So to make sure they're familiar with that. So any officer who's gone through their training would have been trained in the use of stop and search, both in a consensual and in a non-consensual basis.
Rona Mackay, followed by Mary Fee.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I was encouraged by the evidence from the Children's Commissioner, who said that the early consultation had been with children and young people had been particularly useful and helpful. And I'm also encouraged by the fact that you're producing a children and young people's guide. I just wanted to ask if you're content that the issue around children, the child protection issue, is robust within the code?
Well, there was a very significant and concerted attempt to make sure that we captured the views of young people around the use of stop and search, given that there had been such a significant level of concern about the way in which consensual stop and search was being used with young people. In fairness, it's a credit to my officials in the way in which they've taken forward this work and in making sure that young people were fully involved in this process. I'm content that the code gets the balance right and that we've been able to make sure that the views and issues of young people have fed into the process in shaping it. And as you'll be aware, the code has a specific part to deal with children. What we need to do is just to monitor that going forward and to make sure that that balance is the right one. If there are any issues of concern or areas where we can improve it, that we address those going forward. And I think it's reasonable to say that over the next year, the next 6 months to a year as we review it, we'll be able to identify whether there's any further work that needs to be undertaken. But once the code is introduced, the level of clarity we'll have in these issues is way beyond anything we have ever had before when it comes to stop and search and the way in which it will be applied to children and young people. So I'm confident that we'll have much greater clarity and understanding of that, and also we'll have much clearer data around the use of stop and search. You'll be aware that one of the issues that was raised during the course of the consultation exercise was whether there was a legislative gap around being able to search young people for alcohol. I was open-minded on the issue about whether there was a legislative gap that needed to be closed to give the police a specific search power to be able to search young people for alcohol. In considering that, the advisory group have not been able to come up with evidence and data that would support the provision of such a specific piece of statutory power that should be given to the police. What we have said is that we will review that over the next year. So over the next year, Police Scotland will be collating data specifically on this matter, and they will then share that information with the advisory group, which will then provide an interim report to myself at 6 months, and then a report after a year. And if after that period of time there is evidence that demonstrates that there is a gap, then it's an issue that we can consider and look at then. But if there is no evidence to support the need for any further statutory powers in that area, then I don't think it would be justified for us to then look at providing a particular statutory power when there is no evidence to actually support the need for it.
Okay, thank you.
Mary Fee?
Thank you. I wanted to ask you for a bit more detail around the review and assessment process. I think the new chapters that have been included in the guide, Chapter 7, where a child is involved, are particularly welcome. And Pauline McIntyre was very pleased to see the new things included in that chapter. And chapter 8 on vulnerable people is also very welcome. And I'm thinking specifically around adults with mental health. I think it's a huge improvement in the code to see that new chapter there. But I just wondered, in the interim review in 6 months, until a code is actually used, you won't know how good it is and if it is actually working effectively. So thinking specifically about the new chapters 7 and 8, at the 6 months review, will you be able to drill down sufficiently to see that the new chapters, the new guidelines are working effectively? And if you find any gaps or any concerns raised, will you be able at that point to change them, or will you have to wait for the year to be up?
Well, I think my only note of caution here is that I think 6 months may be too early to actually give us a true understanding of how the code is operating overall. The reason that I've asked for a 6-month interim report is that if there are some trends emerging, it will allow us to then look at whether we need to do some further work over the coming 6 months to understand that information more fully, so that by the time we get to the end of a year, we can actually supplement any information that's gathered over the course of that year by Police Scotland with any other additional work that we might want to do during that period if trends are emerging. So what I would say to you is that if at 6 months there are issues around how it's being applied to individuals who are vulnerable, whether it be someone with a learning disability, someone with mental illness, that we need to consider, at that point it would allow us to then look at whether we need to do anything further to understand that more fully, so that hopefully by the time we get to the end of a year we'll be in a better place in understanding the full extent and the nature of the issue. So I think a year is probably a reasonable time frame for us to give us that broader understanding, but that's a 6 months almost health check will allow us to then identify whether there's any emerging trends, and in these areas, if there are emerging trends, whether we need to do a bit further work to understand that more fully so that we can then look at the issue in the overall review after a year.
That's helpful, thank you.
I wonder, Cabinet Secretary, I mean, the code is very much welcomed and has been well thought out, and I think everyone's very relieved that there will be a review and it will be monitored as it goes along. If you could comment on some of the reports in the press about the cost of implementing the training, etc., which was, I think, monitored or muted at 3 million at a time when when the police budgets are under quite a bit of pressure.
Well, the figures are nothing new in that the figures are part of the BRIA, which went alongside the drafting of the code. So it's already information which we've provided and calculated. The way in which it's been managed is through the ongoing training provision for officers through Police Scotland. So and their ongoing training of constables. So the information is information which we'd calculated on the basis of some of the IT changes that had to be made, and also some of the information, some of the work around training of officers, and it's been absorbed into the ongoing training programme for police officers.
Okay, thank you. Liam McCarthy.
I was going to ask you about the separate powers in relation to stop and search around alcohol, but I think you've probably given as much of an answer to that as you can. But following up Douglas's earlier line of questioning about the potential for an increase in use of stop and search in areas where it's historically been lower. I mean, I quoted the figures previously of a reduction of 99.5% in consensual stop and search, and an overall reduction in 93 in a bit percent of stop and search as a whole. What has been the figure for the use of statutory stop and search over that period? Because, as you say, consensual stop and search made up the vast bulk of the figures up until that point.
I don't have those figures to hand, but I can get you the most up-to-date figures if that would be helpful.
I mean,
around the use of statutory stop and search.
I mean, that would be helpful, but I mean, even just in terms of the trend that we've seen over that 12-month period, I mean, has it remained largely kind of static, and that 93.5% is just made up sort of principally by the the numbers of consensual stop and search kind of falling off a cliff, or has there been a reduction in statutory stop and search as well over that period?
I think on the issue of consensual stop and search, I think the more up-to-date figures will show that it's declined even further. Right. And this is all in preparation to the code coming in, where consensual stop and search will no longer be used. But in terms of the overall figure, the most up-to-date figure on the use of statutory stop and search, I can come back to you with the accurate details on that from Police Scotland and where their figures are at the present time.
Right. I mean, I think also the point you were making in relation to the additional bureaucracy, and Douglas quite rightly highlighted the concerns that Callum Steele was raising, but I think ACC Williams, as well as talking about the increase in public confidence and transparency, I think made a point of saying that actually in the interests of police officers themselves, that transparency very often provided them some protection from allegations of inappropriate use. So in a sense, the benefit wasn't simply to do with public confidence and the relationship between the public and police officers, but to some extent was actually presenting additional protection to police officers. The way in which they were using it was far more transparent, and therefore the opportunity for allegations to be made about misuse were much reduced. Is that something, again, that you would recognise?
Yeah, I do, and you can see from the evidence which you received from ACC Williams in response to the issue that Douglas Ross had raised, and that was about the way in which stop and search is just one way for officers to gather intelligence on a particular issue. There's a range of ways in which officers can actually gather information and intelligence. I think the point that ACC Williams was also keen to impress on was the need to make sure that stop and search was being used in a legitimate, accountable way that the public could have confidence in. And I think it's important that our responsibility in government and parliament is to set that framework within which the police can operate and to give the police clarity around what their role is and how they should fulfil their duties as well, so that we're doing everything possible to support them in the very important and the very good job that they do for us. So I think some of the amendments that have been made to the code at a draft stage are reflections of the views that have been expressed by constables in saying, look, we need greater clarity around some of these matters, particularly the point around being able to search someone who may be in a vulnerable individual who may be at risk of committing suicide. So to provide them with that additional assurance and that additional clarity. So I think it helps them in having an understanding of what the rules are and how it should be applied in a way that previously has not been there. And some of the historical issues that you raised earlier on around the collection of data and the reliability of that data, I think reflects a considerable level of different interpretations on how it should be applied and when it should be used and how it should then be recorded. What the code will do is it will remove all of that uncertainty. So it will provide the police with clarity, but it also provides the public with clarity and ensures that it's been taken forward in a way which is, I think, ensures legitimacy of its use as a valuable tool as and when it's necessary, but also there's appropriate accountability around how it's being used, given the very invasive nature that stop and search is, because it's an invasive tactic which invades an individual's personal privacy, and we need to make sure we get those checks and balances right. And I think the code, by and large, probably gets that balance right, but we'll be able to make sure we continue to assess that over the next year.
Just more broadly, I mean, I think we've all accepted that the place we're at now in terms of the code of practice is very welcome. I think it's also acknowledged we've come a long distance from the point where my colleague Alison McInnes and to be fair, John Finney were raising this routinely in committee in Parliament. Has this prompted the government to look at other areas where almost established practice may need a bit of challenge function exerted? I mean, I appreciate that that's the role of ourselves as members of this committee, but have the government sort of asked Police Scotland to look at other areas of the tactics that they use, the approach that they use in carrying out their duties. A
little bit, but it's up to the Cabinet Secretary if you want to respond to that.
Well, look, I think it'd be fair to say that, you know, I established the advisory group recognising the concerns that there were about the use of stop and search, and I had concerns when I became Cabinet Secretary about the data and the quality of the data and the information which was available to us and understanding how it was being used and the way in which it was being used as well. And there is a danger that if an appropriate tactic is used incorrectly or inappropriately, it can undermine public confidence in the validity of its use. And I think the Code of Practice helps to give us that level of assurance and will help to support public confidence in how it's being applied. In that way, as I mentioned earlier on, I think it helps to give the police legitimacy and accountability around how it's being used, but also public confidence in the way in which it will be used and the rights individuals have and how it's being applied. On some of the broader issues around it, I'm always conscious that there is, it's important that the police are able to use a range of tactics and approaches which can help to make our communities as safe as possible. So, for example, one of the areas which I know the member has an interest in is around the use of biometrics. The use of biometrics is growing considerably, and its application within tackling crime is an important element of, I think it will be an important element of how we meet some of the challenges around new and emerging crime going forward. As that develops, I think it's important that we have appropriate safeguards in there and how biometrics are going to be used and the way in which they will be used and what the oversight role will be out with the police and how biometrics are being used. So that's an area which I know HMICS has raised, which I welcomed at the time, and it's an issue which I'm giving a considerable amount of consideration to at the present time. And the reason why I think it's important to address that is not because I don't want the police to be able to use these things. I want them to be able to use them, but to have a structure in place that actually provides accountability, legitimacy, and also can give public assurance around how they're being applied. And as that whole area develops, I think it's important we make sure that we support the police and be able to use these things appropriately and legitimately as and when it's necessary. And one of the most effective ways I believe we can do that is by providing the right type of oversight structures that can give us that level of public reassurance and accountability. So, so that may be an example of where I think from government's perspective is trying to help to support the police, but to do so in a way that also it gives the public confidence in how they're going about using these types of new and emerging technologies as we go forward.
John Finney.
Yeah, I just wanted the Cabinet Secretary to pick on something my colleague Ray MacArthur said there, and I'm paraphrasing, or one interpretation of what he said could be that this code is righting some historic wrong. The reality is that there are common law powers of search, there have been statutory powers of search in relation to drugs, in relation to offensive weapons, firearms, which were applied without incident, largely without incident for decades on end. That legislation goes back over half a century. The aberration was this so-called nonsense of consensual search, which this now addresses. So rather than bring in some brave new world, it's reinforcing something that was being properly operated in the past. Would you agree with that characterisation?
Well, I agree with that, and because there's a whole range of different statutes that provide search powers in different situations. And of course, this only deals with search powers when it comes to individuals who have not been arrested. There are then obviously search powers which are dealt with under standard operating procedures within the police for anyone who has been arrested. So, my view, it gets into a much better place and provides much greater clarity around these matters, both for officers and also for the public. And it allows Parliament to have oversight on how, what the rules are and how it should be applied. It will also provide us with greater data so that we can see much more transparency around this matter. And if Parliament is minded at some point in the future to look at amending and changing the code, then Parliament will be the body will decide on whether there should be any amendments or changes which the government might bring forward at some point if that's necessary. So I think it gets us to a much better place, and it gives Parliament a much clearer role in setting down that framework for what is you know, one of our most important public services in the country, the police, but also balancing that against the rights of individuals to go about their daily life.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to make any closing remarks, Cabinet Secretary?
No.
No. Okay. The third item on the agenda is formal consideration of the motion in relation to the affirmative instrument. The motion is motion 03459 that the Justice Committee recommends that the Stop and Search Code of Practice Appointed Days Scotland Regulations 2017 draft be approved. Can I invite the Minister to speak and move to the motion?
Moved.
Fine. I put the question then. Are there any questions from members? Everyone satisfied? I think we've had a good session on that already. I put the question, therefore, that the motion 0349 in the name of Michael Matheson be approved. Are we all agreed? Great. We are all agreed. That concludes consideration of the affirmative instrument. The committee's report will note and confirm the outcome of the debate. Are members content to delegate authority to me as convener to clear the final draft report? Great. Thank you for that. I now suspend to allow the Minister and his officials to leave. Thank you. We have on the agenda today is consideration of a negative SSI. This is the Title Conditions Scotland Act 2003 Rural Housing Bodies Amendment Order 2017 SSI 2017/7. I refer members to paper 2. Do members have any comments? No comments? Okay. Then is the committee agreed that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? Agreed. Thank you. Our next agenda item is feedback from the convener of the Justice Subcommittee on Policing on its meeting of 12th January 2017. This will be a verbal report, and I refer members to paper 3 and invite Mary Fee to provide that feedback, after which there will be an opportunity for any comments or questions. Mary.
Thank you, Convener. The Justice Subcommittee on Policing met last week to agree its findings on the draft Stop and Search Code of Practice and its forward work programme. And the letter outlining the subcommittee's views is included in the paper, as well as an updated work programme, and I'm happy to answer any questions or appreciate any comments that anyone may have.
Any comments on the report? If not, then we move to the next item, which is private session. The next committee meeting will be on the 21st of February, when we'll take evidence on the Limitation Child Abuse Scotland Bill and consider our draft report on the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Inquiry. The next item on